Hi, this is Peter Cowie. Ingmar Bergman was at a very critical stage of his career when he made Wild Strawberries. The script was written in the winter of 1956. Privately, Bergman was in a great deal of anguish. The split-up with his third wife still rankled, and his relationship with the actress Bibi Andersson for some reason or other was coming to a conclusion. Plus, he really had a very poor relationship with his parents. He wanted somehow to find those parents again. And so, while in the hospital, being treated for an ulcer that he often complained of when under pressure, he would sit in a small room looking out for miles and miles to the north of Stockholm. His friend Sture Helander was chief physician at the clinic, which dealt with something as new and unusual, says Bergman, as psychosomatic disorders. There he conceived the script for Wild Strawberries. This was all during a hectic period when he was the director of the Municipal Theatre in Malmö, and he was churning out productions with considerable speed. He had a major premiere in March of 1957 with Ibsen's Peer Gynt, and went almost straight from the theatre into the summer shoot of Wild Strawberries in July and August of 1957. He cast in the part of Isak Borg the veteran actor Victor Sjöström. Sjöström had been one of the great founders of the Swedish silent cinema, alongside Mauritz Stiller, in the teens and 20s of the last century. But by 1956, Victor Sjöström had long retired from acting, and for many years had been an advisor at Svensk Film Industry. But Bergman had made real friends with him in 1949, when he had been shooting To Joy, in which Sjöström played the aged conductor, Sönderby. And he also remembered that Sjöström had saved him in 1946, when his first film as a director, Crisis, was living up to its name and about to founder. Everyone wanted to close down the production and fire Bergman, except for Sjöström, who advised his colleagues that this young man had talent and should be persevered with. The music over the credits by Erik Nordgren sets the tone, haunting and yet with an undertone of conciliation. It telegraphs a mood of nostalgia tempered with uncertainty. Sjöström himself was at this stage a difficult man to deal with. He was already 79 years old and had been accustomed to running the show himself. What saved him in this role, however, was his ingrained experience as an actor, even more than as a director. He'd been regarded in his distant youth as the most handsome man in Sweden, and was known more as an actor than director. "I never stopped prying, shamelessly studying this powerful face," said Bergman in his diary. "Sometimes it's like a dumb cry of pain. Sometimes it's distorted by mistrustful cruelty and senile querulousness. Sometimes it dissolves into self-pity and astoundingly sentimental effusions." Wild Strawberries is a film that takes us almost immediately deep into Bergman's psyche. He has said that the dreams and nightmares in it are all real. They are all experienced by him. He's one of those fortunate people who can remember their dreams. This opening nightmare, which when one sees it for the first time has an incredibly physical, almost visceral impact, pays obvious tribute to the German silent cinema that Bergman admired very much. Stuffed with symbols, lit by Gunnar Fischer in a glaring, stark, black-and-white manner that just wouldn't work in colour, and filmed entirely on the backlot of the so-called Film Town, the studios owned by Svensk Film Industry just outside Stockholm, where the street was recreated. The sequence suggests, I think, one of the most frightening realities of our dream world, that is, seeing ourselves. The cliché goes that if you see yourself in a dream, you're going to die. Most of the time, of course, you don't. You yourself are the protagonist in the dream. Everything happens to you. You regard the action. You are the viewer, as it were, of your dreams. And this sequence not only works in its own right as a perfect example of Grand Guignol, rather like the opening flashback in Sawdust and Tinsel, but also as a foretaste of what will happen during the rest of the film. Bergman's intense dislike of sunlight has often prompted him to use harsh, glaring whites in sequences like this, and indeed the opening of Sawdust and Tinsel. Now, part of this sequence was shot in the old town of Stockholm, at dawn so that there would be no public walking around the streets. And the special effects people at Svensk in the 50s created a kind of balloon-like model stuffed with blood that would collapse on impact with the sidewalk. This is an effect that Bergman uses in The Seventh Seal too, where Gunnar Björnstrand taps a prior on the shoulder in the beginning of the film and it turns round and it's a skull. Here the figure is a harbinger of the death that Isak Borg knows he must face, but also, of course, a reminder that in order to purge himself before achieving serenity, he has to make a journey into his past. Bergman chose the name Isak Borg very easily. The initials, IB, are his own, Ingmar Bergman, but they also stand for Is, ice, and Borg, which is an old Swedish word for fortress, ice fortress. In other words, the personality that resolutely refuses to confront emotions. There's a nice nod here to The Phantom Carriage, which Sjöström had directed in the early 20s, and which also dealt with death and redemption. Here, when the wheel crashes into the lamppost, we have a wonderful use of sound because the sequence has been so silent, apart from these sudden moments of high drama. And now the squeaking and squealing of the coffin, seeking to break free of its moorings, reminds one of a baby also. In an act of parturition, the coffin will slither out of the carriage like an infant emerging from its mother. This contains the real nub of the movie, the struggle between the dead and the living, and the need to escape from the fear of death in order to live in some kind of fulfillment. Now we come to the climax of the dream, when Isak approaches the coffin. He's almost mesmerized, compelled to do so, and will, of course, pull his own body up towards himself. Note how Bergman uses the rich black of the clothes and of certain backgrounds in this sequence. So good on DVD, actually. As he gets closer and closer to his image, so Isak will awake at dawn in consternation. Bergman says in his memoir, Images, quote, "I created a figure who on the outside looked like my father, but was me through and through. I was then 37, cut off from all human relations. It was I who had done the cutting off, presumably as an act of self-affirmation. I was a loner, a failure. I mean a complete failure, though successful, of course, and clever and orderly and disciplined. I was looking for my father and my mother, but I couldn't find them." Unquote. So that's something, I think, that enables the viewer to recognize why Wild Strawberries is so powerful. It's because the director so clearly identifies with the main character. It's interesting that Bergman has become very like Isak Borg in his everyday habits. As I record this commentary, Bergman is in his 84th year and lives alone on the island off the east coast of Sweden that has been his home since the 1960s. Each hour has its appointed task, he told his friend Jörn Donner in a recent conversation.
Är professorn sjuk?
Fröken Agda, var vänlig och gör i ordning lite mat. Jag tar bilen.
Snälla professorn.
Here you have the no-nonsense housekeeper, Miss Agda, played by Julen Kindahl, who was a stripling, merely 72 when she acted in Wild Strawberries. She is a surrogate mother to Isak Borg, who is someone who still needs to have his breakfast prepared, his clothes folded and his bags packed before he can go anywhere. It's clear in these initial sequences that Isak Borg is a very significant man in his field. He's an eminent professor of medicine and must be held in great esteem and awe by his profession because he's going to be given an honorary doctorate in Lund. Now, Lund is in the very south of Sweden, in fact near Malmö, where Bergman was directing in the theatre. It's a very ancient university town and ranks alongside Uppsala, making them a kind of Yale and Harvard of Sweden. Wild Strawberries will become a road movie in the sense that Isak Borg travels from Stockholm to Lund by car, and during the course of this odyssey he will encounter a number of people, get involved in a number of incidents, have a number of experiences, all of which will change him, and lead him to some kind of spiritual release by the close of the film.
Ikväll att jag inte är gift med professorn. 74 år har jag handlat efter eget förstånd. Och det ska inte svika mig idag heller.
Är det fröken Agnes sista ord i den här saken?
He is obviously a bit grumpy and irascible to be with, but at the same time there is a softer side to his character that enables him to accept Miss Agda's maternal rebukes. Bergman has been accused of having a feudal outlook towards servants. But in fact these faithful old retainers, like Miss Agda, are just affectionate portraits, tributes to people who have contributed to his own childhood happiness. They're not to be confused with major characters integrated in the themes of his work. The faculty should have made me honorary idiot, he says. I think there's already a superficial recognition that in his private life, Isak has been conspicuously unsuccessful and clumsy, both emotionally and physically, by comparison with his professional career, where his intelligence has enabled him to shine and prosper. It's a theme common to most of the great movies about old age. Kurosawa's Ikiru, for example, or Angelopoulos' Eternity in a Day, with Bruno Ganz meandering through contemporary Greece in search of some answer to that perplexing riddle, why do we lose touch with the world as we age, even if our spirits are still acutely sensitive? And like those old men in those films, Victor Sjöström here wanders around his apartment, fiddling with books and touching things. He's obviously got nothing more to do in his professional life.
Professorn har rostat på det.
Det är inget besvär för min skull nu.
Vad är han sur för?
And now, at this breakfast scene, we'll have another character introduced. Actually, a rather crucial character. Isak's daughter-in-law, Marianne, played by Ingrid Thulin. Ingrid Thulin was elegant, gifted, and, like all Bergman's actors, a riveting performer on the stage. She was then married to Harry Schein, a former film critic, who would establish the Swedish Film Institute in 1963 and play a pivotal role in the Swedish cinema of the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. Ingrid Thulin was so noted in this film that she was quickly given Hollywood parts. She appeared in pictures like Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, opposite Glenn Ford, and later in Visconti's The Damned, opposite Dirk Bogarde, as well as with Yves Montand in Alain Resnais's masterpiece, The War is Over. She radiates that cool intelligence that is somehow at war with emotion, and that makes her the ideal companion for Isak Borg on this trip. She knows that he's intolerant on small matters, but she accepts him as a father-in-law. We've seen a photograph of the professor's son, Ewald, in his study at the beginning of the film. He will remain a rather mysterious figure, at least until Gunnar Björnstrand comes on the scene later in the day. But it is obvious that beneath this graceful, cultivated exterior, there is something about Marianne that is deeply unfulfilled. So in a way she becomes a younger counterpoint to Isak Borg. Both of them are yearning for affection without necessarily articulating that need. These interior scenes in the car are pretty obviously back projection. But we accept that expediency in the same way as we accept the bright, almost garish technicolor of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's films, such as Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes. We accept that it's part of the artifice of the cinema, particularly of that period, the 50s. The intensity of the dialogue is so strong that one's eyes are diverted inwards, away from that back projection, and into the psychological nuances of Bergman's writing. Now, for the first time, the real feelings behind Marianne's icy exterior become plain, as she begins to dig at Isak, her favourite uncle in quotes, and we the viewers begin to realize that he is not as amiable and avuncular as he appears on the surface. This conversation, indeed, is much more unsettling than the bickering between Isak and his housekeeper. Bergman himself has said that he was sure that he was the child of a cold, dead partnership between his mother and father, and for years he quarrelled with his parents and declared that he hated his father. His father Erik had been a prominent pastor in the provinces and then in Stockholm. He was a man held in equal esteem as Isak Borg is here, but someone who was very domineering in private life. He would punish his children severely, and the bishop in Fanny and Alexander is a rather brutal portrait of this stern, almost doctrinal way of bringing up a family. Pastor Bergman was chaplain to the royal court, to the late Queen Victoria of Sweden, and was a man with whom Bergman had very little daily contact until the final days of the man's life. The most rounded portrait of Erik Bergman would emerge from his grandson Daniel's affectionate feature, Sunday's Children, made in 1992 from a screenplay by Ingmar. So to some extent, Wild Strawberries is an attempt to exorcise these unhappy memories, and Bergman's screenplay even dictates that Evald should be the same age as Ingmar himself would have been when Isak, his father, would be as old as Pastor Erik Bergman. One thread runs through the story in multiple variations, he recalled later. Shortcomings, poverty, emptiness, and the absence of grace. I didn't know then, and even today I don't know fully, how through Wild Strawberries I was pleading with my parents, said Bergman. See me, understand me, and, if possible, forgive me. Bergman's own relationships with his children have been somewhat iffy at best. Although in his 9th decade he keeps in close contact with most of them. One became an actress. Another, Daniel, has made some distinctive films of his own. Others yet have followed more orthodox, anonymous lives. All, however, assemble on July the 14th each year to be with their father on his birthday. Where Bergman differs radically from Isak Borg is in his refusal to abandon his work. He still produces plays and directs operas. He still writes screenplays for television and the cinema, such as Faithless, directed by Liv Ullmann in 2000. This immense car, which will at some point be seen to accommodate up to 7 people, was in fact a 1937 Packard. Bergman felt that it should appear as ancient as the professor himself. When we do see it from a distance, the car looks like some funeral limousine, a hearse bearing a man who is already dead, spiritually anyway. Now they arrive at the scene of Isak's youth, a spot on the Swedish coast where the family would keep a villa and come every summer for the traditional vacation. Again, the recollections are almost exquisitely personal, and the ritual of Bergman's own summers on the island of Små-Dalarö, south of Stockholm, will be reconstructed in Wild Strawberries with affectionate fidelity and authenticity. His was a privileged childhood in a material sense, even if he was held in bonds of rigid discipline by his family. In fact, this house, used by the unit, was outside the resort of Saltsjöbaden, much closer to Stockholm in reality. But we'll see inside that the spotless tablecloth and the sparkling appointments and the bickering among the relatives and the dominance of the aunt all will evoke the genteel bourgeois world in which Ingmar Bergman grew up in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Through this encounter, as it were, with the Wild Strawberries, Isak enters his past. Strawberries have a particular significance to Swedes. They symbolize the bright days of summer and of life itself. They are the fruit that you find in the forest glade, away from the cultivated gardens of conformity. The lovers come upon them in Bergman's Summer Interlude, for example. The title of the film, Smultron Stället, actually means the wild strawberry patch, meaning that it's a place itself that serves as a threshold of vanished memories. In many of his films of the 1950s, Bergman would use images of clouds and trees and water as a psychological transition between reality and memory, past and present. Here we see Bibi Andersson for the first time, as Isak's boyhood crush, Sarah. Bibi was then still only 21. She had been living with Bergman for some time and was an indispensable figure in his troupe of actors at Malmö Municipal Theatre. She had made her breakthrough with a brief appearance in Smiles of a Summer Night 2 years earlier. This was followed by the sympathetic and idealistic role of Mia in The Seventh Seal, in which she stood for the incarnation of Bergman's perfect woman, alluring, docile, understanding. Bibi would become much less docile as the years passed by, taking controversial roles in films like Jacques Daniel Valcroze's Rape, in Maid Zetterling's The Girls, in Vilgot Sherman's film about incest, My Sister, My Love, and in the greatest moment of her career, in Persona for Bergman. She also flirted briefly with Hollywood, playing in Ralph Nelson's gory western Duel at Diablo, and in John Huston's The Kremlin Letter. Even in 2001, she continues to appear on stage in Stockholm. Siegfried is played by Per Sjöstrand, who was a little older than Bibi and had not worked with Bergman before. In fact, he would only appear in one more of his films, as a man we see in a museum briefly in The Touch, which Bergman released in 1971. By making the other suitor so suave, so superficial, Bergman is of course allowing us to identify still further with Isak Borg, while at the same time absorbing the fact that Isak is someone to be suspected, full of fine words and abstract sentiments, but lacking in the coarse-cut, earthy sexuality that others can offer. Bergman is able to bring these memories to life with extraordinarily vivid force, more so than practically any other director. Think of Cries and Whispers, or Fanny and Alexander. When I look at my brother, he told Liv Ullmann some years ago, it seems only yesterday that we were running barefoot in the garden, and I feel a fear inside me. He's still startled by the speed at which the years run by. And he has an ability to remember even the smallest detail, whether they be toys like the ones in Fanny and Alexander, or noises, or smells, or light. Wild Strawberries is a beguiling manifestation of a phenomenon that happens to nearly everyone in old age, the loss of short-term memory and the resurrection of childhood memories, almost as though our brain's hard disk were jammed to capacity. We can't save new information, but we can flip back through the files of youth and see them plain and vivid as the day they were created. The flirtation between Sarah and Siegfried may strike us as stagey, but as the film unfolds, this scene will assume a kind of ritualistic significance, a state to which Isak has aspired, but never achieved. Bergman is also able, in a scene like this, to leaven the high seriousness with which we associate European cinema in the 1950s and 1960s. He leavens it with a flair for comedy, almost boulevard comedy, and will continue this as the family assembles inside the house for brunch. The flag is hoisted in true patriotic tradition, and that wonderful evocative music of Erik Nordgren creeps in.
Birgitta och Kristina, var är Isak någonstans?
Here are the twins who say and see everything in unison.
Och far sa förresten att vi inte skulle vänta med mat.
One of them is played by Lena, Ingmar Bergman's daughter, by Elsa Fischer. Now we have a very simple but clever device, whereby Bergman enables the old Isak Borg to wander literally into his youth, to watch his family assembling and observe what was happening almost 70 years earlier. Now in the foreground is Gunnel Lindblom as Charlotta. Gunnel Lindblom was an important member of Bergman's team at Malmö, and I recall seeing her in 1959 when Bergman brought his production of Urfaust to the London stage. Gunhild played Margareta to Max von Sydow's Faust and Toivo Paulo's Mephistopheles in an absolutely riveting production. Gunhild Lindblom's most notorious role is that of the Dark Sister in The Virgin Spring, who calls down the wrath of Odin on her demure, beautiful, blonde and of course virginal sister. Not so long before making Wild Strawberries, Bergman had taken an early morning trip to Uppsala. He wanted, on an impulse, to visit his grandmother's house. He stood outside the kitchen door and, for a magical moment, experienced the possibility of plunging back into his childhood.
Du är kolsvart under naglarna.
Sif Rudd there is the actress playing the aunt, with a formidable presence.
Smör på rätsidan av brödet. Charlotta, saltet har klumpat sig. Hur ofta ska jag behöva säga dig att det inte får stå framme för salt fuktar sig?
Jag har tvättat händerna med målarfärg under naglarna.
The strawberries are offered in a light-hearted yet ambivalent way to Uncle Aaron, as they are in The Seventh Seal when Mia passes the bowl to the knight, Antonius Block. A ritual of summer and the bright days of life.
Kom ihåg farbrorns namnsdag. Det var sannoliken väldigt av dig.
One of the abiding strengths of Bergman's cinema is the quality of his actors. They would stay with him literally all the year round. Most of the people in this scene worked with him in Malmö, in great roles or small, during the winter and spring on stage, and then, in the short, brilliant Swedish summer, making a film.
Maten, tysta mun. Dessutom gick ni ifrån era sängar obäddade.
The costumes, so evocative of a particular time and place, are by Millie Ström. She wasn't a designer used by Bergman before or after, although costumes always meant a great deal to him. Margot was the primary costume designer of the 1950s and 60s on whom he relied. Then, towards the end of his career, he turned to Anna Asp, who deservedly won an Academy Award for her costumes on Fanny and Alexander.
Fast man vet inte riktigt säkert vem det är som är Fritjof.
The family table is a familiar setup in Bergman's interior scenes. Everything from the small table set for 4 people alone on the island at the beginning of Through a Glass Darkly to the great gatherings in Fanny and Alexander. And Bergman uses them to show society's intended solidarity. The family gathering is so important, but more often than not, the outward harmony disguises interior tensions. This is one of the rare areas in which one can say that Bergman reflects Swedish society of a certain time and place, with its smiling formality and its reluctance to air emotions, save in private. And now, in full view of Isak Borg, the 2 young women, Sarah and Charlotta, talk to each other. As always in Bergman, 2 women talking are more convincing than 2 men. Anyone who speaks about sin is suspect in Bergman's book, and this is not the only time that Isak will be obliged to overhear what people think of him. The Lutheran religion runs like a bass line through all of Bergman's films of the 1950s. He was so steeped in the everyday rituals of practicing Christianity during the first 17 years of his life that even in his 30s he could not quite shake himself free of its dogma. Bergman has never worshipped as an adult, and yet his films are in many respects as religious as the work of a Bresson or a Dreyer. One senses behind so much of his writing the exasperation of someone who wants to believe, but who needs some proof of a God's existence. That's what The Seventh Seal and The Magician are all about. Not all Bergman's early summers were spent here on the eastern coast of Sweden. Many were spent in Dalarna at Vorums, the family house, a period vividly reconstructed by Bergman in screenplays, first for Eva in 1947 and then in Sunday's Children in 1992. He remembers how it was a family tiff that led to them deciding to go to the archipelago and the kind of villa depicted here in Wild Strawberries. Bergman refers to Smådalarö as an idyllic place. For me, he wrote in The Magic Lantern, the archipelago was a bewildering revelation. There were summer visitors and their children there, many of them of my age. There were adventurers, beautiful and cruel. I was spotty, dressed wrongly, stammered, laughed loudly and without reason, was hopeless at all sports, dared not dive, and liked talking about Nietzsche, a fairly useless talent on the stony shore where we bathed. The girls had breasts, hips, bottoms, and a cheerful mocking laugh. I lay with them all in my hot little attic room, torturing them and despising them. And now Isak Borg begins to recollect how elusive Sarah had been. She remained for him throughout his life, one assumes, like an ideal, tantalizingly beyond his grasp.
Och sorgsenhet överföll mig. Men jag väcktes strax av mina drömmerier av en flickröst.
And so he is roused back to the present.
Frågade mig om något.
Är det här din kåk?
Nej,
And here we have a not entirely convincing case of the same actress playing two parts. It works in Buñuel's That Obscure Object of Desire, where two actresses play the same role, but the other way around is always tricky. Bibi Andersson is the modern Sarah, hip, for the 50s anyway, and self-confident, condescending towards age without being offensive, and towing in her wake two clumsy suitors, Anders and Victor. These hitchhikers will tag along for the rest of the ride and provide Isak with some kind of anchor in the naturalistic world. Theo Angelopoulos used the little boy as a similar metaphor in his wonderful Cannes Prize winner of 1998 about an old man confronting imminent death, Eternity and a Day. Marianne has had her swim and greets the teenager cheerfully enough, even if she sees that Isak has been flattered by all this youthful attention.
Ironisk igen. Men det klär dig. Ska vi sticka då?
Ja.
Hej killar!
Anders and Victor enter the scene here. Anders, in the check shirt, is played by Folker Sundqvist, who had made his name in the early 50s with One Summer of Happiness, the Arne Mattsson film that caused a press frenzy at the time because of one nude bathing sequence. Victor is played by Björn Bjelfenstam, who had had minor parts in Waiting Women and Smiles of a Summer Night for Bergman. The modern Sarah is in complete contrast to her counterpart in the past. No ringlets or crinolines for her. Instead, it's a pipe and coming on strong with a tomboy savvy. It's amusing to find that the character we might call Sarah 2 treats her two men friends with such withering condescension, in total contrast to Sarah 1, who quivers with respect and almost awe in the presence of both Siegfried and Isak in the scenes we've already watched.
Bäst jag upplyser Isak om att jag är oskuld. Det är därför jag är så fräck i mun. Så räcker jag pipa. Det är nyttigt, säger Victor. Victor är galen i allting som är nyttigt.
Now we learn from Isak that his boyhood sweetheart did in fact marry Siegfried and had 6 children. That was the end of his ideal.
Hon blev gift med min bror Siegfried. Hon fick 6 barn. Nu är hon 75 år och en riktigt vacker liten gumma.
Jag kan inte tänka mig något värre än att bli gammal. Förlåt. Nu sa jag bestämt något dumt i alla fall.
Bergman, like Hitchcock, is never very happy with action sequences. He sets them up carefully and edits them meticulously, but there remains something clumsy about their execution. Still, as with Hitchcock, it really matters, because it's a consequence of the action that counts rather than the special effects with which it may be achieved. Here we're introduced to 2 of the most ominous and unsettling characters in the film, who thrive on sarcasm, irony and vindictiveness.
Hur gick det? Vi har inga ursäkter. Skulden är helt och hållet på oss. Det var min hustru som körde.
Significantly, the husband's name is Alman, which is like every man in most other languages, and Berit, his wife, seems demure, but is able to deliver some very painful thrusts of her own when provoked. They leap straight from the pages of Strindberg, who included such couples by the dozen in his plays about failing marriage.
Så mycket som man sa när man var liten. Var mitt fel alltsammans. Jag skulle just klippa till min man när den där kurvan uppenbarade sig. Ja, där ser man en del straffa Gud med detsamma.
Stein Alman is played by Gunnar Sjöberg, who had made his debut on the screen 20 years earlier, and who was used by Bergman on stage and in film as the embodiment of intellectual intimidation, almost a death-like figure. In Brink of Life, for example, he plays a doctor who looks on the miscarriages of his patients with an eerie detachment. He also appeared in a satirical role in The Devil's Eye, as the Marquis de Macopazza.
Han spänner sina slaknade lemmar för att stoltsera inför den söta flickan.
In real life, the character of Alman represents a little act of bitchy revenge by Bergman on one of his adversaries in the Stockholm life of the period. Stig Ahlgren, a critic with a waspish pen, who had stung Bergman with one particular comment so much that the director struck him during a squabble in front of several people. Alman has the same biting sarcasm as, of course, Isak himself must have had when he was young. And to some extent, the Berit-Alman relationship mirrors what we gradually discover to have been Isak's own relationship with his long-dead wife, fettered together in scorn and mutual dependence, and yet unable to break free. Stig Ahlgren's own wife, the novelist Berit Tengroff, the woman who in fact wrote Bergman's Thirst, was not dissimilar to Isak's wife in looks, as we'll see in a future scene in a forest glade. Gunnar Broström, there on the right, was very charismatic in this film and on the stage in Malmö, but never really made it as a star in Swedish cinema. For once in this film, the characters' silence is almost as eloquent as their dialogue.
Jag kan aldrig skilja på om min hustru gråter äkta eller om hon gråter teater.
There's also a flavour of Strindberg in these exchanges. The concept of wedded life as being a kind of war to the knife. As the character Mummy says in Strindberg's play The Ghost Sonata, crime and guilt and secrets bind us together, don't you realise? Our ties are snapped so that we have slipped apart innumerable times, but we are always drawn together again.
Hon var så övertygande så vi trodde mer på henne än på läkarna. Det är skickligt. Jag kände.
Det är rimligt att ni är uppskärrade, herr Ahlman. Men hur skulle det vara om ni lämnar hustru i fred en liten stund?
Kvinnornas gråt åt kvinnorna. Rör inte vid kvinnornas tårar, det är då heliga. Ni är vacker, ni min bästa fröken. Vad nu heter. Gamla Berit däremot börjar bli lite sjabblig, därför har ni råd att försvara henne.
Isak attempts to remain detached from these bitter exchanges between Alman and Berit, but one senses that they are percolating into his subconscious, and the presence of the young Sara in the back of the car reminds him of his lost youth.
Hustrun är ju katolik.
Alldeles rätt, ja. Det är mitt sätt att härda ut. Jag förlöjligar min hustru och förlöjligar mig. Hon har sin hysteri, jag har min katolicism.
Alman persists in taunting his wife in public, needling and laying on the sarcasm until the tension builds to snapping point. One of the reasons Bergman creates this kind of character is to avenge himself on those critics who delighted in mocking his early work. Like many artists, he's susceptible to anything less than fulsome praise. The explosion of violence, played down by Alman, is nonetheless a shock both to the youngsters and to us, the viewers. And Marianne decides that this is just too much and asks them to get out of the car. It's as though she recognizes Alman and Berit as dangerous intruders, too close for comfort to her own rough-edged marriage, and also to Uncle Isak and his sardonic comments. But as we'll see later, these two characters will surface again in Wild Strawberries, sewn as they are in Isak's psyche. And they're left alone in the empty road like so many Bergman couples shackled by their own vulnerability and mutual loathing. The long shot emphasizes their pathetic stance and their insignificance in the grand scheme of life and nature. Motoring through a landscape whose gentle, harmonious lines are so at odds with the spiritual turmoil of the film, Isak recalls his early days as a doctor.
Dels har jag här min första praktik. Dels bor min gamla mor i ett stort hus strax i närheten.
The next stop is less taxing for him. Here at the filling station is Max von Sydow, playing his second part for Bergman after his monumental success the previous year in The Seventh Seal. This was almost an act of friendship, to play Åkerman with a cheerfulness and bucolic simplicity not usually associated with von Sydow, who in the mid-50s grabbed most of the plum roles in Bergman's Malmö stage productions. He was in The Misanthrope, he was in Faust, Peer Gynt, he played Brick in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Naming his son after Isak, Åkerman seems to the old professor to represent the adulation that he has enjoyed throughout his professional life. This time, though, the admiration seems warm and spontaneous, reminding Isak of qualities that have eluded him in the big city drive for success. The professor asks after his parents, and when Åkerman says they're doddery, recognizes that he too is getting on. Isak perceives that he has abandoned something of the innocence of his youth. He realizes, like the old man in Angelopoulos' reflective masterpiece Eternity and a Day, that it all could have been so different, and that the pastoral, lyrical sunlight of the past has been replaced with the somber tones of age.
Finns inte det minsta skäl att ni skulle betala min bensin. Ja, jag uppskattar vänligheten.
Man minns ju saker, förstår doktorn. Och det finns sånt som inte kan betalas. Inte ens med bensin.
Nej, vi glömmer ingenting i första taget.
Nej, fråga vem som helst här i stan. Eller på...
Once again, Bergman is able to introduce a sinister, deeply disturbing note at the very end of what's been a light-hearted little scene. And the close-ups of Isak Borg remind us of how brilliantly Victor Sjöström could suggest his inner conflicts, with a sideways slide of his eyes and a faint trembling of his lip.
Ja, tack i alla fall. När du tar över så kanske jag kan komma stå fadder för den nya Åkermannen. Ni vet var jag finns.
Jaha, tack.
They pause in the very centre of Sweden, midway down the long drive to Lund. This meal scene strikes us in sharp contrast to the brunch recalled by Isak from his youth in the archipelago. There's a serene quality to the gathering, even if Bergman is careful not to let it become too wishy-washy or portentous.
Både vin till maten och portvin till kaffet.
Ack, när så mycket skönt i varje åder av skapelsen och livet sig förråder.
So he will let Anders and Victor and Sarah argue over abstract conceits, while Isak observes their antics with a relaxed and tolerant eye.
Jag anser att Anders lyriska utbrott är ett avsteg från vår överenskommelse.
Vad vackert, vet jag.
Och för övrigt fattar jag inte hur en modern människa kan bli präst.
Informal with brandy and cigars circulating liberally. In the open air with one of the largest inland lakes in Europe, Lake Vättern, spreading amply in the background, as opposed to the carefully designed interior of the villa. This luncheon allows Isak to roam free, as it were, to enjoy the company of people younger than himself.
Står inte ut med meningslösheten.
För all del. Religionen åt folket. Opium åt den verkande lämmen, om det är så du menar.
Är inte fantastiskt vad de är söta? Jag håller alltid med dig jag sist talar med.
Och hörru du, när du var liten trodde du på tomten, nu tror du på Gud.
Och du har alltid lidit en häpnadsväckande brist på fantasi.
Now he has a chance to recite one of his favourite poems. It's a psalm by J.O. Wallin, much loved by Swedes of that generation. And its words echo what I said a few minutes ago about Bergman yearning for proof of a god, although I don't think he swallows this rather sentimental pantheism.
När dagen gryr, min längtan blott sig öker. När dagen flyr,
När dagen flyr, jag än ej honom finner.
Significantly, he stutters over the line about finding God because Isak is still searching. He has by no means come to the end of his journey. These moments rank among the most poignant in the European cinema of the 1960s. They rank with Maurice Ronet's encounters with his friends the day before he commits suicide in Louis Malle's wonderful Le Feu Follet, or, more recently, with the final hours of the old couple in Fredrik Thor Fredriksson's Oscar-nominated Children of Nature.
Ja, som kärleksdikt betraktat är det inte så illa.
Nu blir jag så högtidlig igen. Jag kan bli det alldeles utan vid.
In his early career, Bergman shot rarely on location. He tended to be happier inside the studio in the film town in Stockholm. But Wild Strawberries took him out of the studio and to some of the most attractive vistas in Sweden. Now Isak and Marianne motor the short way to the home of Isak's mother, which seems as forbidding as the castle home to which Antonius Block returns in The Seventh Seal. Clearly, mother and son meet each other at rare intervals now. We see the mother first reflected in the appalled gaze of Marianne, who stares at this relic as though she were already dead. The mother thinks for a moment that Marianne is Isak's own wife, whom she clearly loathed. There existed in Swedish film and theatre during the 1950s few more charismatic personalities than Naima Wifstrand. She was a veritable pillar of the Malmö Municipal Theatre, and on screen really contributed tremendously to Bergman's films. Think of the regal, sardonic mother she played in Smiles of a Summer Night, organising the party at her country domain that will unleash such emotional mayhem. Or think of her old witch-like character in The Magician, with her pet crow and a leather cap encircling her distinctive features. And now, suddenly, in this scene, Borg himself becomes the child, respectful in the presence of his mother, who must by now be well into her 90s. The whole room resembles a mausoleum. It's though all life had been sucked from it, and the mother is like a mummified figure, a living death. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot, you can see the skull beneath the skin. For once, though, this mother does not resemble Bergman's real-life mother, Karin Åkerblom. Karin was a courageous and charismatic woman to whom Bergman has paid tribute in films like Billy August's The Best Intentions or Liv Ullmann's Private Confessions. And compare this sequence with the opening scene in Bergman's The Touch, where Bibi Andersson sees her mother's corpse in a hospital bed. There one can sense Bergman's infinite pity for his mother, whom he grew to appreciate with every passing year. Bergman likes mementos like this, dolls, toys, photographs. They appear increasingly in his films, particularly as he grew older. He used his own family album photos in several films to illustrate a vanished era, something which of course he had disliked intensely when growing up, but to which he had felt drawn the more his career advanced, and the more impossible it became for him to go back and rewrite the past. After his parents had both died, Bergman set about paying tribute to them in various indirect ways. There's a lovely little short film he made called Karin's Face, consisting only of photographs of his mother and her family. Then there are the films that he wrote about them, for example, Sunday's Children.
Älskar jag i alla fall pappa. Och Birgitta har lagt till, jag ska gifta mig med pappa. Är det inte lustigt? Jag skrattade när jag såg det. Är det inte kallt här inne?
Don't you think it's cold here? Well, naturally, you are in the chamber of death, in a tomb. Anything can be explained by low blood pressure, but metaphorically it shows that the mother herself was frigid.
Ska vi inte be syster Elisabeth att ordna lite te åt oss? Nej. Så kan vi sitta och språka.
Nej tack, mor. Nu ska vi inte besvära längre.
Ja, men Titta här.
Now we see the watch with no hands, which immediately triggers a memory in Borg's mind of the nightmare with which the film opened. It suggests that time no longer exists as a measured entity, and justifies the film's and Isak's drifting from one era to the next with scarcely a blink. When she describes Siegfried's boy having just been born and lying in his basket, this image is inserted into Isak's subconscious, and we'll see that it takes shape soon afterwards. We, the shocked spectators, are wondering at what juncture the old man lost his way in life. And through the film, Bergman shows us incidents that give a clue to this conundrum and leaves us to make up our minds. Was it back in the days when he was a young doctor and became so revered by the likes of Max von Sydow's gas station attendant? Was it all the way back at the summer villa when, a callow youth, he tried to woo Sarah? Was it when he left the countryside and came to the impersonal ambience of the great city? Isak has begun to warm to the flattering attentions of Sarah. She may be flippant and garrulous, but she seems genuinely interested in him as a human being, not as a stereotypical father or uncle or professor that those closer to him perceive.
Skrika i mun på varann. Och Anders tog fast Viktors arm och försökte vrida den ur le. Då sa Viktor att det var väl ett taskigt argument.
Bergman often, as I've said, leavens his high seriousness with comedy. It's a clever ruse to stave off pomposity.
Det här var en principdebatt. Och då gick jag. Så stack de upp i backen för att göra upp. För båda påstod att de hade sårat varandras innersta känslor. Så nu ska de slå varann på truten.
Var är de nu då?
Med där uppe.
This is typical. The two boys, Victor and Anders, are like clowns in Shakespeare. They defuse the intensity of the drama. At the same time, they offer a satirical reflection on the absurd behavior of people like Isak and his son and Marianne. In a way, too, when we see Anders and Victor bickering, it's like a parody of Alman and Berit quarrelling in that earlier scene in the car. If one notes that one is a science student and the other a divinity student, then, as one critic said at the time, Sarah's companions form a living oxymoron.
Kan man tro på Gud?
Isak revels in the fact that Sarah is taking him into her confidence and talking about the respective merits of her two suitors. He rather likes that. Once again, he's in the role of everybody's favourite uncle. Not surprising in a director who has lived all his life in a northern climate and would indeed choose a remote rain-swept island for his ultimate home, the changing weather is an obvious but essential sign in Bergman cinema. And once again it almost provides a bridge into the dream which is one of the most frightening in the film.
Jag somnade, men förföljdes under sömnen av drömmar och bilder som föreföll mig ytterst påtagliga och förödmjukande. Jag kan inte heller förneka att det i dessa drömsituationer fanns något betvingande som borrade sig fast i mitt medvetande med en nästan outhärdlig...
Gunnar Fischer's wonderful black and white photography uses the dusk scenery to suggest genuine menace. No longer is the strawberry patch a sunlit, inviting refuge. Instead, it's a place of malevolent inquisition. The strawberries are lying abandoned on the grass, and Isak is forced to confront himself in Sarah's ruthless mirror. Bergman's individuals abhor the mirror because in it they contemplate a truth they are reluctant to accept. In film after film after a film they appear. In Summer Interlude from 1950, the ballerina slowly removes her makeup in the dressing room mirror to reveal her troubled features beneath the mask. In The Virgin Spring, the doomed young blonde gazes into a barrel of water, revelling in the perfection of her beauty like some Narcissus of the Middle Ages. In Cries and Whispers, more than 20 years later, Liv Ullmann's character looks into the mirror while her doctor lover, crouching behind her, points out her flaws. The face becomes a mask in the theatrical sense of the term. A mask expressing joy or sadness, anger or pity. That's why Bergman uses close-ups so frequently. a habit that's rather rare among movie directors who come from a stage background. As Wild Strawberries progresses, we can chart a subtle change in Victor Sjöström's features. His whole face reflects the anguish and tension of his trial, as it were, until at the end of the film his expression is serene and smoothed out. "You know so much and you don't know anything," says Sarah, a very tart encapsulation of Bergman's belief that the professions, the army, law, banking and so on, are composed mostly of shallow people who have no knowledge of life's profound emotions and challenges. The music of Erik Nordgren is noticeable for perhaps the first time, just in sweeping chords, but very effective, and all the more so for not being obtrusive. Although this scene was shot in the studio, the use of the bare black branch in the background is a marvellous example of Gunnar Fischer's artistic eye. It's as though nature is exerting a threatening influence over the baby and over young Sarah. The baby is not so much real as symbolic, a token of emerging life struggling against an inhospitable environment. Sarah cherishes and encourages the infant, just as her namesake does to Isak in real life.
Snart är det dag igen. Ingen gör dig ont. Jag är hos dig. Jag håller om dig.
The lighted villa also represents warmth and vibrancy. The music sings and the birds wheel across the sky as Isak approaches the cradle. Age and infancy confront one another. He looks down briefly into the cradle as he looked down into the coffin during his first nightmare, but this time the baby has gone, for it is not his, but Siegfried's. The full branch curling over the image seems, as I've said, to be threatening him, like the silhouette of death as he glides into frame in the seventh seal. The noise of the wind blends with the music as Isak approaches the villa, and is obliged to witness a scene that he would so dearly have loved to have celebrated with Sarah. Erik Nordgren told me years ago that he would always receive a script of Bergman's films, but would not be asked to compose any music until each film had been cut and was almost ready for release. Bergman himself is so musical that he often sketches some music into his screenplays as he goes along. The tableau is made more humiliating for Isak by the formality of it. The beautiful clothes, the angle at which Siegfried kisses his beloved Sarah, and the way her neck is presented so openly to him. It's as though Isak recognizes that in the straight-laced society of his youth, he would have been obliged to accept his brother's triumph in love and raise his own glass in an admission of defeat. Now Isak must face utter loneliness, and only the glaring moonlight is there to guide Isak as he moves like a blind man along the walls of the house. We know by hearsay that Isak must be revered as a prominent professor and famous physician, but with each passing scene he appears more hesitant, more insecure. Another symbolic incident is about to occur. As Isak gazes up at the moon and realizes that the villa is empty, he puts his hand up against a nail lodged in the frame of the door. He sees with some puzzlement that he has wounded himself, but of course in this context it is like the stigmata, a reference to Christ, a reference to Isak's own imminent suffering. And guess who opens the door? None other than Alman, reincarnated as a brisk, coldly efficient individual. No longer the helpless husband, but someone who will prove to be absolutely relentless in his inquisition of the professor. Bergman's characters must often submit to interrogation. This sequence is reminiscent in tone to The Ritual, in which 3 people, described as entertainers, are interrogated by a tax inspector, allegedly for smuggling money into Switzerland. A totally different context, but Bergman's tone is exactly the same. Allman is himself myopic where relationships are concerned, and so it's ironic that he should be the one meting out this fiendish inquisition to Isak. The change of sets is brutally unsettling for both Isak and us, the audience. The comfortable, lived-in atmosphere of a summer villa has become a cross between a drab office building and a college lecture theatre. Here Borg is, in one way, on home territory. He is a distinguished physician. He should be completely at ease during his examination. Instead, he's back to his pre-graduation days, being forced to endure a viva voce. He gives his examination book to Allman without a moment's hesitation. He enters completely into the charade, almost as if hypnotized. He begins his succession of errors, for this is an examination not of his abilities as a medical practitioner, but of his skill at observing real life and dealing with real people and real relationships.
Jag kan inte se någonting.
Jaså. Vill ni vara snälla läsa den här texten?
Inge, tan, magro.
He tries to read the text on the board, but he cannot recognize in this gibberish the Hippocratic oath, the need for forgiveness that each doctor learns when they embark on their craft. He stumbles anxiously in his attempt to recollect the oath, because asking for forgiveness is something that he has never considered, never needed to consider, he'd say. Isak has been obsessed with concrete facts and statistics, a man of science rather than a man of spiritual, abstract notions.
Om jag får tänka mig för.
Ta god tid på er.
En läkares första läkare. Det har jag glömt.
En läkares första plikt är att be om förlåtelse.
Ja, visst.
Now he turns to the audience in the lecture theatre and begins to realize that these are people he has seen in real life. Anders and Victor in the front row, and Sarah, all curiously unsmiling, and all out of reach in this nightmare.
Skyldig till skuld.
Skyldig till skuld?
Jag antecknar att ni inte förstått anklagelsen.
So in this sequence, the roles of Isak's life are reversed. He, who for so long has been stern and unapproachable for his patients and for those in his private life, he is now subjected to the same kind of comments and callous reactions that he once dealt out.
Jag har dåligt hjärta.
It's ironic that he should plead for a break on medical grounds, rather than emotional ones.
Står ingenting om ett hjärta i mina papper. Vill ni kanske avbryta tentamen?
Borg's subconscious is ready to continue with this purgation of his past. And now comes someone else who he is aghast to see, none other than Allman's wife, Berit. She appears immobile, like Isak's other acquaintances in the examination room. But then, exactly like Ingrid Thullin's Veronica Vogler in Hour of the Wolf, she comes alive with a mocking laugh, ridiculing Isak's powers of diagnosis. The whole scene becomes a chilling metaphor for Isak's inability to interact with his fellow human beings. But it is accomplished by Bergman in sounds and imagery that are triumphantly those of the cinema, catching the audience by the throat just as our guard is relaxed. Isak has failed his exam. He is found incompetent, not as a doctor, but as a human being.
Fullt allvarliga förseelser, känslokyla, själviskhet, hänsynslöshet.
Nej.
Anklagelserna har framställts av er hustru. Ni ska konfronteras med henne.
for the first time we become aware of Borg's long-deceased wife. And through the miracle of the dream state, he will be able to recall the moment when he witnesses not just her infidelity, but will have to hear her scathing assessment of his personality. This whole scene is intriguing because Bergman's original intention was that Sjöström and Gunnar Sjöberg would walk through a dreamlike landscape to reach the boulder where Åke Fridell and Gertrud Fried are seen embracing. Bergman had the exotic idea of placing snakes all over the place, and in an interview many years ago he described the chaos. In the big studio we constructed a terrarium and managed to get all the snake fanciers in Sweden to bring their protégés. I should think that we must have had between 200 and 300 adders. When the time came to let them out, all the snakes had vanished. It turned out there was a hole in the terrarium. For weeks, snake fanciers were out here in Rasunda retrieving their little darlings. But the scene works with unsettling brilliance in any case. We're introduced to two of Bergman's favourite actors. Gertrud Fried had been a performer on stage in Malmö and made a wonderful Corinne von Merkens in Hour of the Wolf. She radiates a kind of earthy, almost professional sexuality, allied to a sarcastic, domineering look. This makes her perfect in the role of the wife who has betrayed Isak Borg, but who has already seen that in his complaisant reaction there is a heart of ice. The man is played by Åke Fridell, who was the smith Plog in The Seventh Seal, and also Tubal, the coachman in The Magician. He also had an antic role in Smiles of a Summer Night, as the lecherous groom. Jan Troell, too, used him to tremendous effect in Here Is Your Life as a travelling charlatan. Fridell had a reputation for imbibing generous quantities of liquor, and the night before Bergman shot the Dance of Death scene, the final scene in The Seventh Seal, the actor had been out on a binge. He'd fallen down some stairs in a state of some disarray and hurt his ankle. So Bergman was forced to replace him with an assistant director at the last moment for the silhouetted lineup that has become probably the most imperishable of all Bergman's still images. If many of Bergman's films deal with the dilemmas of human beings uncertain of their role in the universe, then an equal number are devoted to man's guilt as reflected in the mirror of his own experience. Guilt not just sexually, but in terms of spiritual loyalty. In Through a Glass Darkly, David the novelist keeps a diary about his schizophrenic daughter in order to make a new novel. And in Liv Ullmann's Faithless, scripted by Bergman, the Erland Josephson character is palpably Ingmar Bergman himself, forced to look back on an unhappy affair in which he himself played such a guilty role. There is a sly, knowing quality in this scene. In a few sentences and shots, Bergman communicates the jaded desire and then the stale weariness of a post-coital conversation, while also contrasting the sophistication of the encounter with the frivolous gallivanting of Sarah and her boyfriends in the present-day sequences. Anyway, this taut little sequence captures the very essence of infidelity, and it's done in a theatrical idiom with the spotlight on the small glade and Isak watching from the wings. Many Swedes criticized Bergman during this period for being too theatrical in his films. It's true that his love of stage technique is often manifest, yet by some strange alchemy he contrives to transcend the boundaries of stage performance. Time and again it's the close-ups that arrest us, the close-up that, by definition, the theatre can never offer.
Och då säger han att han ska hämta mig något lugnande och att han förstår alltsammans mycket bra.
Gunnar Fischer's lighting makes the best use of this glade, highlighting the small open space where the couple have made love and then giving so many ominous shadows to the surrounding woodland. The light on Gertrud Fried's face is soft yet unrelenting as she gives vent to her bitterness. Nobody can write such lacerating dialogue as Bergman in circumstances like this, and actually it's almost a monologue for Gertrud Fried. She has summed up Isak's fundamental disdain and condescension with an accuracy that leaves him speechless as he watches from the shelter of the trees. And on an ultimate note of irony, Ullman explains that everything can be eliminated, erased by a surgical operation, something that Borg has performed so many times over the years, the perfection that only the scalpel can accomplish.
Ingenting som smärtar, ingenting som blöder eller skälver.
Det är verkligen ganska tyst.
En i sitt slag fulländad gärning, professorn.
Och vad blir straffet?
Straffet? Det vet jag inte. Det gamla vanliga, antar jag.
Gamla vanliga?
Ja, visst.
Loneliness. Loneliness is like a mantra in Bergman's films. Not solitude, which is acceptable to Bergman. Indeed, he leads the life of a hermit himself on the remote island of Fura in the Baltic Sea, and regards this as a key to survival. But it's more the idea of being left alone by those you dearly love that is terrifying. Now he returns from his dream and finds Marianne in fairly conciliatory mood. She's been sneaking the smoke that he resented so much earlier in the car, and the way she stubs it out is no longer a gesture of anger, but more of sensitivity.
Insisterar de på att få hylla dig?
Herregud.
Har du sovit gott?
Ja, men jag har drömt. Kan du tänka dig det sista?
Isaac talks about his dreams. Bergman has said that he retains a vivid image of his dreams. For most of us, dreams vanish in the morning, but Bergman is able to recollect them in minute detail. Nearly all his films have originated in dreams. And the demarcation lines between dreams and everyday actuality soon become blurred. So Isaac's comment about his finding himself dead in his nightmare triggers Marianne's own recollection of her argument with Ewald about having a baby. Just that single word, dead, reminds her of the moment when she must have decided, come what may, to opt for life rather than sterility.
Jag ville tala med Ewald och så tog vi bilen och for ner till havet. Ja, det regnar precis som nu. Ewald satt där du sitter.
So now we come to one of the most ominous and disconcerting of all the sequences in the film. It's a flashback, not a dream, and the only one in Wild Strawberries. Once again, the rain sets the tone. On the left is Gunnar Björnstrand, on screen for the first time in Wild Strawberries, but a massive figure in the Swedish cinema of the 1950s and 60s. An extraordinary actor who seemed rather stiff, but in fact on stage in Stockholm and in one or two films revealed a comic side to his personality. I saw him shortly before he died in a residence for elderly folk north of Stockholm. He was still in good fettle. We had supper with his good-humoured wife Tilly, and the meal was served sharp at 5:30 in the afternoon. Plates of what they call blood soup were set before us. It looked dark and rich, but tasted good. "Are you sure you can take this?" he asked me with a quizzical smile. "Well," I replied, "better than nothing." "Better than nothing! Better than nothing!" he roared with laughter as he repeated the phrase. When I'd seen him in the lobby of the theatre where The Silence, with its risque sex sequences, had just opened in Stockholm in late 1963, he took off his fur hat in formal greeting. "What did you think?" he asked. "It is a bit much, isn't it?" There he seemed to project a rather proper Swedish reaction to the film, but, as I've said, underneath he was capable of a sardonic turn of wit. In a role like this one, he can express Bergman's thin-lipped refusal to countenance emotion and the warm things of life. Probably his greatest role was that of the squire in The Seventh Seal, playing Sancho Panza to Max von Sydow's Don Quixote, although some would opt for his anguished pastor in Winter Light. In Through a Glass Darkly, he embodied the artist's ability to accept that he uses friends and family as a source of material and inspiration for his work. His final role for Bergman was a rather pathetic appearance in Fanny and Alexander, but by then he was already close to death. Men in Bergman's world seem unmoved by children or even by the prospect of birth. Only in the latter stages of his movie career did Bergman write some rewarding roles for kids. Fanny and Alexander, for instance, where not only the brother and sister are well-developed parts, but the Jarl Kulla uncle figure embraces the notion of fertility and celebrates the newly arrived babies in a grand meal sequence.
Och du då?
Mitt behov att vara död. Absolut orörligt död.
That's a very seamless cut by Oscar Rosander, Bergman's great editor of the period, so that immediately one's back in the car with Isak, but Marianne is wearing exactly the same expression as she was in her exchange with Ewald. She raises again the spectre of Isak's mother. Bergman has said that some children are born from cold wombs. I think it's a horrible idea, little embryos lying there, shivering with cold. It was out of that line in the dialogue in Wild Strawberries, "I feel so horribly cold, what can it be due to?" particularly here in my stomach, that the mother came into being, he said. She ought really to have died long ago, remarked Bergman.
Iskall allt igenom. På något sätt mer skrämmande än döden själv.
Marianne has seen the mother standing there among all the detritus of a past life, and she senses an icy chain of boredom and aggression.
Själv säger han att han är en levande död. Så Ewald, som håller på att bli lika ensam, kall och död. Och så tänkte jag på min unge som jag har i magen. Så tänkte jag att det är bara kyla och döda och ensamhet hela vägen.
She's relieved to discover that Isak no longer slaps her down. Instead, he's become more understanding, sympathetic even. It's this, more than anything, that gives her the inner courage to return to Ewald's side. Although there's an interesting line coming up when Miss Agda says she already told Ewald that Marianne was on her way, as though she, the wily old bird, had felt some sixth sense that Marianne would in fact do so.
Vi är för gamla, Isak. Det har gått för långt.
Vad hände efter ett samtal i bilen?
Ingenting. Jag reste ifrån honom dagen därpå.
Har han inte låtit höra av sig?
Isak himself points out that Marianne is going back to Ewald, even if, like Alman and his wife, they are shackled for life. There's a sense in Bergman that although couples may break up, they will remain forever linked at some profound level. Marianne foresees the danger, of course, of becoming like Alman and Berit. And for the first time, almost cleansed by his dreams, Isak has been willing to refer to his own marriage. If by this time we're getting a bit tired of Anders and Victor and the contemporary Sarah, we should pause to reflect that perhaps Bergman knows this, and that their very warm and effusive adulation for Isak, like that of the gas station owner, is really typical of the superficial praise he has received throughout his professional life, and that has made him impervious to criticism.
Tack så mycket. Nu måste vi fortsätta. Klockan är mycket redan.
The light around him dwindles to darkness, almost for the last time. This is Lund Cathedral, where the splendid 30s model limousine rolls up. Miss Agda has arrived safely and immediately assumes her role of surrogate mother, come housekeeper, come valet, hurrying Isak along for the ceremony.
God dag, Marianne. Jag har förberett Ewald på hennes ankomst.
Tack. Det var ju bra.
Fröken Agda reste i alla fall.
Ja, jag ansåg det som en plikt. Men nöjet är förstört. Det kan inte bortresoneras.
Now Isak is welcomed to another house, but this time it is a clean, well-lighted place. Here Ewald appears in entirely different guise. Courteous, elegant, not unlike Siegfried in that tryst at the piano witnessed by Isak a short time earlier. He is rather embarrassed in front of his wife, yet clearly delighted that she has returned to the marital home. Their body language tells it all. This is a relationship where there's still a hell of a lot of work to do, if it's to be salvaged. Isak has done pretty well to arrive by 4:15, because the distance between Stockholm and Lund is over 400 miles, and Isak has not been driving like the wind in his vintage Packard. But that's poetic license. And there Isak sees through the door, almost as in one of his dreams he gazed into his childhood summer home, and sees the hint of a reconciliation between Evald and Marianne.
Nå, ska vi gå på middagen efter, eller hur blir det?
Ja, jag ska bara ringa Stenberg och säga att jag har dam med mig. Han ordnar sånt.
Det är bråttom, professor.
Now to the ceremony itself, all the pomp and circumstance of an honorary doctorate being bestowed at university level. Isak is back where he so often belonged.
Isak!
And Sarah calls from the crowd. All the other spectators wear their white caps. Those caps are the mark of a graduate student at Swedish colleges. In Uppsala and Stockholm and Lund on the 1st of May, the students all dash outside and toss their freshly awarded caps into the air, and indeed retain them throughout their later years, lunching with friends and former students on the 1st of May holiday reunions, until those caps turn yellow with age.
Primo, filium, meum, sumo, et capiti, meo, impono.
In Sjöström's expression, there's a wonderful acceptance of the fact that all this gunfire, all this ceremonial, is relatively meaningless by comparison with his own learning process during this long day of confrontation with the past. In his book, Images, Bergman writes, "What I had not grasped until quite recently was that Victor Sjöström took my text for Wild Strawberries, made it his own, invested it with his own experiences, his pain, his misanthropy, his brutality, sorrow, fear, loneliness, coldness, warmth, harshness, and ennui. Borrowing my father's form, he occupied my soul and made it all his own. There wasn't even a crumb left over for me. He did this with the sovereign power and passion of a gargantuan personality. I had nothing to add, not even a sensible or irrational comment. Wild Strawberries was no longer my film. It was Victor Sjöström's." Bergman himself loathes such occasions. Even though he has been awarded countless major prizes, he has rarely popped up to receive them, not even his Academy Awards. I did persuade him once to come for a talk at London's National Film Theatre, but he agreed only on condition that we discuss the late Alf Sjöberg's films, not his own. Of course, once he was there in front of a sympathetic audience, he relaxed, and indeed afterwards had a couple of beers, something which his wife said she had never seen him do.
Det kan jag inte neka till.
Ja, men tar du en av mina sömntabletter?
Nej, tack.
So now Isak is back in the safe care of Miss Agda, who doles out his sleeping pill. He apologizes. She refuses to accept that. She's never heard him apologize before, so she's rather shocked. Unlike nearly all of Bergman's films of the period, Wild Strawberries closes on a note of great serenity. A drawing of drapes, a dimming of lights, a soothing of the fevered brow after the long day's journey. It's even more appropriate that Isak should be going to rest in his son's home, in the usual room, to quote Evald. He has returned to his family, as it were, and in his pyjamas he cuts a much more genuine figure than he did in his ceremonial garb at the cathedral. Feisty still, but unmistakably chastened by his journey into the past.
Att vi som har känt varandra och varit så goda vänner i en hel mansålder, att vi skulle kunna lägga bort tid.
In the tartness of the dialogue there's a whiff of Smiles of a Summer Night or A Lesson in Love, Bergman the writer of rapier-sharp exchanges. Agda is almost teasing Isak, giving him the treatment that he has probably given his patients throughout his life. But now Isak is anxious to reach out for human warmth and contact. This bickering is much more convincing than the bickering between the young Sarah and her suitors.
Ja, de skulle göra sig lustiga.
Handlar fröken Agda alltid rätt?
Nästan alltid. I vår ålder bör man veta hur man ska bete sig. Inte sant, professor?
Godnatt, fröken Agda.
It's all part of a mating game at root. and Miss Agda's sly, almost naughty, implied invitation to Isak as she leaves the door to her room open gives a droll twist to the relationship. He goes to the window, hears singing, and finds once more a gentle serenade that evokes his youth and enables, at last, the two Saras to fuse in his mind. He has gone back across the years and recovered his lost love. Young Sara has been influenced also by her encounter with Isak. She's become less superficial, more passionate, readier to take on more of the risks of life. Bibi and Victor had flirted harmlessly with each other throughout the shoot, and one senses that this marked a very real farewell.
Tack för sällskapet.
Adjö, fader Isak. Förstår du att det är dig jag älskar? Idag, imorgon och alla dagar.
As she says those words, it's you I love, today, tomorrow, always. The words of Sara in the strawberry patch, the words he longed to hear when Siegfried was wooing her so much more vibrantly than he ever could do.
Adjö. Hör av er någon gång.
Sjöström would die 3 years later in 1960. He had been a remarkable personality in the Swedish cinema, dominating it as a director and actor throughout the teens and early 1920s, sailing to Hollywood and making masterpieces for MGM like He Who Gets Slapped and The Wind, returning to Europe, becoming a senior figure at Svensk Film Industry, a kind of producer in residence, and then forgotten for about 10 years until Bergman resurrected him in 1957 for this film. So, just as the life of Isak Borg comes full cycle in Wild Strawberries, so the life off-screen of Victor Sjöström seemed to come full circle too. The reconciliation between father and son would not occur between Bergman and his own father until much later, until in fact his mother died in the 1970s. That event, described obliquely in the opening scene of The Touch, brought the ailing pastor and his rebel son together for the final years of Eric Bergman's life. Bergman once said, "When we're young, we reject our parents, we rebel against them. When we grow older, we come back to our parents, and in that moment we have grown up." Certainly this is a scene that suggests this sentiment. One can hardly imagine Evald talking to his own father like this if he'd appeared at the beginning of the film.
Angående den där skulden som du har.
Oroa dig inte. Du ska få dina pengar.
Det var inte alls så jag menar.
Du ska nog få dina pengar.
Hej! Hur mår du, farbror Isak?
Jo, tack bra. Mycket bra.
Jag tappar en klax, jag måste byta.
If there's been a note of conciliation between Evald and his father, there's one of deep understanding love between the daughter-in-law and the old man. And a sense of anticipation as Marianne begins her own new journey again with Evald.
Jag tycker om dig också, farbror Isak.
The irony of this concluding scene is that Isak recalls his childhood as a means of achieving peace of mind, even though it has brought him such unhappiness during the journey to Lund.
Återkalla minnen från barndomens värld. Så gjorde jag även denna afton.
Now, in the final moments, he returns to the sunlit villa beside the shores of the archipelago. This means more to Scandinavians than to anyone else on earth, for the summer in Sweden and neighbouring countries is so brief, so charged with a kind of intense pleasure and revelling in nature.
Jag har redan letat efter honom, men jag hittar varken far eller mor.
Jag ska hjälpa dig.
And Sara will take him down to the jetty to find his parents. And one of those people in that long shot was Elsa Fischer, Bergman's first wife. Their daughter Lena played, as I said earlier, one of the twins in the film. Through these metaphorical fields of asphodel, Isak Borg approaches a reconciliation with his life. In this entrancing shot, the father's fishing rod forms a perfect arc. It makes the image seem that much more serene. Isak, like Bergman in the long run, has recovered his parents, returned to his roots. And so, with a final flutter of chords from Erik Nordgren, we end on these close-ups of Isak Borg. A beautiful dissolve to his waking, this time not in mortal fear and trembling, but at ease with his subconscious at last. His eyes open, willing to accept the world as it is.